So we all know Red Bull have been completely dominating every race of the year so far. Their win in Austria marked their 10th win in a row and means they've now won 19 out of the last 20 races, with only Russell's win in Brazil last season being a non-Red Bull driver. So times are tough for the other teams, but the scrap for that second position in the championship is a feisty one. Mercedes, Ferrari, Aston Martin, and based on Austria there's a fair call to add McLaren into the mix, courtesy of Lando Norris. However, there could be reason to think that the scrap is becoming somewhat more of a two-horse race. While it could be said that Aston Martin have been comfortably in the scrap for P2, the only reason for this is the superior skills of Fernando Alonso pretty much completely carrying that team. And while he may still be getting great results, notably that second place in Canada very recently, the performance gains of Mercedes and Ferrari in the past couple races shows Aston Martin can't rely on just Alonso to get their points. The pace difference between Ferrari and Aston Martin in Austria could act as the beginning of a trend where the upgrades brought by the more established front-runners of Mercedes and Ferrari will begin to usurp that advantage Aston Martin have held all season so far. This was a trend that we were expecting at some point in the season, as it was inevitable that the greater resource juggernauts of the sport would simply outdevelop Aston Martin as the season progressed. But it could be said that's not quite the case, with Mercedes and Ferrari being very inconsistent in their pace from race to race. Spain was a clear message from Mercedes that they were back in the fight, but come Austria, that advantage completely disappeared. While for Ferrari, Austria was arguably their strongest race of the year so far. So let's actually pick apart the recent upgrades and performances from Mercedes and Ferrari to really understand what these gains and drops in pace actually mean. Right, well, let's start with Ferrari. These guys have definitely shown themselves to perform the closest to Red Bull at times, with Leclerc even beating Max to pole position in Baku in a straight fight. However, their performances have certainly not been very consistent. At times they are easily the second quickest team, whereas other races such as Spain, they are easily the fourth quickest team. But Ferrari's main issue has been race pace. On a Saturday they are quick, usually qualifying in the top 5 reliably when Charles Leclerc doesn't crash. But then come the race, they drop back down through the field. The major upgrades to the side pod brought in Spain aim to fix these issues, but their race pace arguably got worse. Following Spain, Ferrari believed the terrible race pace was from high rear degradation, meaning they didn't have the grip or longevity in the tyres. And so they planned new upgrades to the floor and front wing to help this. Well, thanks to incredibly hard work back at the factory, they were able to bring these upgrades to the Austrian Grand Prix, 2 races ahead of schedule. And well, it was clear these made a huge difference. Leclerc qualified only 0.048 seconds behind Verstappen, but most importantly, comfortably kept second place in the race with a very measured and confident drive. It's clear that these upgrades did indeed help that rear degradation, giving the car greater predictability and robustness. And once the car is more predictable, it means finding the perfect setup is much easier. At a sprint weekend with limited practice time, this is invaluable. However, Ferrari have been very clear that while the performance was a step in the right direction, they still have a mountain to climb if they want to get near the Red Bull of Max Verstappen. And so there is a lot more work to do. Right, now moving on to Mercedes. It's a similar theme, but a very different situation. Their season, much like Ferrari, has been very inconsistent with great performances in Australia and Spain, where none of Aston Martin or Ferrari came close to them, but there have been many races where they struggled to qualify in the top 10 and then come home in the race to pick up very few points. However, come the Monaco Grand Prix, they released their heavily anticipated sideboard and floor upgrades. The following race in Spain, they were clearly second best, and many thought their next target was simply to close the gap from Mercedes to Red Bull. However, the week after that in Canada, it was clear they couldn't match the pace of Alonso in the Aston Martin, and now in Austria, they found themselves comfortably behind not just Alonso and Ferrari, but even the McLaren of Lando Norris. They finished the race in 7th and 8th, and while Hamilton did receive a 10-second time penalty for track limits, this result was representative of their actual pace. When asked, Hamilton simply said he was definitely surprised by the severe lack of pace, saying that the races of Spain and Canada before were much better. While it could be said Hamilton's decision to put more angle in his front wing caused instability in turn 10 and causing all those penalties, their problems stem further than just a bad setup decision. Toto Wolff also said they don't quite know what happened following the improvements made in the previous 2 races. Maybe it was track specific to Austria, maybe track temperature, it seems they're not really quite sure. So all in all, Mercedes and Ferrari are bringing big upgrades to their cars, but they aren't quite delivering as expected. The pendulum of pace has swung between Mercedes, Ferrari and Aston Martin almost on a race-by-race basis. However, as the season progresses, we can expect a little bit more stability moving forward. Anyways, they need stability, because all the while Red Bull are sailing away in the championship, and most importantly, are already developing next season's car. Meanwhile, the teams behind are stumbling over themselves to try and sort out this season, and failing to think about next season. Let's just hope they get their act together soon.